Recently, a litigant named Praval came before the Supreme Court. He was challenging orders passed by the Allahabad High Court and a Lucknow Magistrate Court. But during the hearing, he lost his cool. He called the judges Mr. Judicial Servant. He threw papers and abused the Chief Justice. Now, the abuse was wrong, but the phrase judicial servant is worth pausing on. Because behind that anger, there is a deeper question. Are judges accountable to the people? When a citizen comes to the Supreme Court asking for justice against orders passed by lower courts and high courts, does the Supreme Court really stand outside that system, or does it end up protecting the same judicial establishment? Today, I want to show you evidence for a more uncomfortable argument. India's higher judiciary is not hereditary in law, but it may be dynastic in effect. And if the judiciary becomes dominated by a small circle of elite legal families, then the court is not necessarily independent from its own class. First, look at who sits in the Supreme Court. A recent investigation by the print found that of 33 sitting Supreme Court judges, at least 10 were closely related to former judges, and another 10 had parents or grandparents who were lawyers. In other words, around 60% of Supreme Court judges came from families of lawyers or judges. And this is not just about the Supreme Court. Their investigation found out that among 687 High Court judges, at least 102 were related to former or sitting judges, and another 117 were second or third generation lawyers. So this is a structural problem. It includes judges, former judges, senior lawyers, spouses, siblings, in-laws, children, and extended legal networks. So why is it a problem? Because judges at the higher level are not selected through an open competitive exam. There is no process where everyone can see who applied, who was considered, who was rejected, and why. They're appointed through the collegium system where senior judges recommend names for appointment. The eligibility criteria are broad and the process depends heavily on informal assessment, reputation, perceived competence, and whether the person is already known inside the legal establishment. This is exactly where family background begins to matter. If your father was a judge, if your uncle was a senior advocate, if your family has practiced in the same high court for decades, you're not entering the legal profession like an outsider. You inherit the language, the social networks, the surname, and the reputation. By the time collegium looks at you, that advantage already looks like merit. The system favors accumulated family advantage and then presents it as pure merit. A first-generation lawyer has to prove everything from scratch and is considered more difficult for him or her than for a kid from a powerful legal family. And social science shows this very clearly. Whenever entry into power depends on subjective judgment, dynasty gain an unfair advantage. This happens even in societies that call themselves meritocratic. There's a famous study on political dynasties in the US Congress. The researchers found that political power becomes self-perpetuating. Legislators who stayed longer in office became more likely to have relatives entering Congress later. This was not just because some families were naturally talented. Holding power itself created family advantage. They also found that dynasties were less common in more competitive environments. So when competition is weaker, family advantage becomes stronger. Another study from England looked at surnames and social mobility from 1170 to 2012. The finding is disturbing. Elite status can persist for many generations even when institutions formally become open and meritocratic. Using Oxford and Cambridge attendance, the researchers estimated that the intergenerational correlation of status is between 0.7 and 0.9. This is even higher than inheriting height from your parents. That means social mobility is much lower than we imagine, and this persistence survived huge historical changes like the Industrial Revolution. So formal openness is not enough. A system can look open on paper and still reproduce the same families in practice. And when entry depends on informal judgment, reputation, network, and membership in a professional club, dynasties do not need an official quota. They already have the advantage. The judicial collegium is not a transparent public competition. It is a small group judging reputation and competence. But those are socially produced. So when the collegium says it is selecting merit, the question is merit produced by what? Talent alone or generations of family access? This creates many problems. First, it concentrates constitutional power in a small social circle. Senior judges decide bail, liberty, election disputes, executive power, fundamental rights, federalism, religious freedom, and constitutional morality. If that power is repeatedly held by people from the same legal families, then democracy begins to look very narrow at the top. Second, it creates conflict of interest problem. Supreme Court's own admission in the Law Commission report spoke about the problem of uncle judges, where relatives of judges practice in the same courts. Clients may believe some lawyers have special access, other lawyers may hesitate, litigants may lose faith. Third, and most importantly, it makes accountability harder. A judge may hesitate to criticize another judge. A lawyer may hesitate to complain against a powerful judicial family. A first-generation lawyer may fear retaliation, and slowly silence becomes the culture. This also makes the judiciary more vulnerable to political influence. A broad, transparent, merit-based judiciary is harder to capture. But if power is concentrated in a few elite networks, politicians do not need to influence the whole institution. They only need to cultivate a few powerful people, a few families. That is why opacity does not always protect independence. Sometimes opacity makes independence weaker. And this brings us back to Prabal Pratap. His abuse was wrong, but the deeper question remains. When an ordinary citizen challenges orders passed by courts below, does the Supreme Court hear him as a citizen asking for accountability or someone attacking the dignity of the judicial family? Because the real danger of a dynastic judiciary is that it may hold everyone accountable except itself. Thank you so much for your attention. I'll see you next time with another important idea at Devil Wears Data.